Okay, we are kind of in the middle of chapter 4, page 54. Go ahead and flip there. And Lars rode the bus home after school, and on his way walking to to Penncroft Farm from the bus stop, remember he meets this kid named Geordie, and they play that Huzzlecap game, and then they go skip rocks, and hopefully you're figuring out something's not completely right with Geordie. So, okay. And Geordie's talking about his brother and how he didn't go to college because he says it was too expensive. And then Lars responds, "Didn't your brother apply for a scholarship?" "Nay, Will went off to be a soldier in '77. My father near had apoplexy when he heard tell of it. He was that furious. But Will was set on fighting in the war, and there was no stopping him. Not our Will. We always used to say, where there's a will, there's a way." But Uncle George was killed at the end of Vietnam, and that was way before 1977, I said, bewildered. "'Twas the War of Independency, Lars," Geordie said quietly. "And the year Will went away was 1777. He added, giving me an almost sympathetic look. My knees buckled, and I sank down onto the dirt floor. You can't mean the American Revolution." My voice rose into a squeak. "Aye, against the English king, George III. Father was a loyalist, and rallied against what he called ragtag traitors, who demanded independency. He said the king only wanted us to pay our fair share for the British troops he'd sent to defend us from the Indians and the French. As a lad, father himself had taken up his musket to fight the French for the king. But Will said taxing us without our say was tyranny." I sat on the floor, gasping like a beached whale. Geordie quickly went on. "You see, up until then, Americans had always raised their own money. That way, even though the royal governors were officially in charge, they couldn't carry out anything the Americans didn't want to pay for. But if Parliament could tax Americans directly, the royal governors would control the purse strings and could do whatever they liked. That's what Will called tyranny." Geordie sighed. How father hated to hear him say that. From way up at the house, mother and I could hear them arguing in the orchard. We joked that it would sour the fruit, but no jokes could help heal the wounds in our family. That's why Will finally ran away to join George Washington. "To join George Washington?" I echoed, dazed. "Aye, for my mother it was like to tear her apart. Her being raised a Friend and all. Though she was disowned by the meeting for marrying father, she was still a Quaker at heart. Quakers believe all killing wrong, even in war. They're pacifists." I knew that. I chimed in, glad that something he said sounded familiar. "Anyway, in mother's eyes it was bad enough for Will to take up arms against another human being, for him to fly in the face of Pa's loyalty to England as well nearly split our family like a piece of kindling wood." A wild thought flitted through my head. Maybe this was a trick that someone at school, like the Owens kid, had put this boy up to make a fool of me. But there was something about Geordie that made what he said almost believable. Suddenly the implications of his words struck me, if not dumb, at least into a whisper. But, if you were alive during the Revolution, you must be the oldest person in the world. It was Geordie's turn to look taken aback. He actually blushed a little as he tried to explain. "Well, that's not exactly accurate, Lars. I'm actually phantasm." "Phantasm?" I repeated, mystified. "What's that?" "Some would say an apparition," Geordie said. "Do you know what that is?" I shook my head. Geordie sighed. "I had this same problem with your Uncle George when he was your age. He insisted on calling me a ghost, which I thought was dreadful. The word ghost makes people think of rattling chain and cobwebs and such." He indicated the cobwebs on the riddle with a shudder. "If it's all the same to you, I'd rather be called a shade. That means the same thing as ghost, but sounds a mite more amiable, don't you think?" he asked rather wistfully. I didn't have an opinion on the subject, but since it seemed to matter to him, I nodded. "Now let me get this straight," I said, determined to be calm. "You're a ghost, pardon me, I mean a shade, and you haunt our house. Is that right?" Geordie picked at the cobwebs on the riddle for a moment before he looked up. "I haunt your barn, actually, with the odd trip into the house now and again, like the night you arrived." That roused me from my stupor. "Was that you up there?" Seeing Geordie's nod, I jumped to my feet. "So it was a shade I saw in the window, but not the kind Mom thought it was." I laughed. "And what Uncle George told Mom wasn't a tall tale. Penncroft farm is haunted, just like Uncle George said. Even the wagon's haunted." Geordie bashfully dug the toe of his buckled shoe into the straw-littered dirt of the floor. "I'd be gratified, Lars, if you wouldn't say haunt. I prefer to think of it as hanging out." I looked at him in surprise. "Really? Hanging out?" "Aye, and the barn always was my favorite place to hang out, ever since the raising," he said enthusiastically. The raising? Curious as I was how Geordie had risen from the dead, or whatever, and had come to haunt Penncroft Farm, I didn't really want to hear the gory details. I told him firmly that he didn't have to tell me about the raising if it was too painful. "I mean the barn raising, you sapskull," Geordie said with a lopsided grin. "Nothing the least bit painful about it. People came from miles around to help raise the ridgepole and put up the walls. It was a great deal of fun." "Doesn't sound like much fun, all that work," I put in. "It wasn't just work. We had all manner of diversions, and feasted on apple pie and old cider and good roast beef. Of course the best part was the labyrinth that the older lads made out of hay over yonder to the south meadow. I was so young, I was barely out of leading strings, but I reached the end of the maze before anyone else. I was right proud." Geordie stopped, a faraway look in his eyes. "The only part of the raising I didn't like was the husking bee, a kind of party," he said. "We all sat about, pulling the husks from the ears of corn. It was my terrible misfortune to husk an entirely red ear." He gave me a significant look. I gave him back a blank one. "A red ear? I don't get it." "Whoever husked a red ear got kissed by all the girls. When I saw I'd husk one, Will saw it too. He whistled to call attention to the fact." He grinned. "Will had the loudest, most piercing whistle you can imagine. Mother said he could outwhistle the wind and forbade him doing so indoors. But Mother wasn't husking corn that day, so Will whistled until everybody screamed and covered their ears. That gave me a chance to ease out the toad I happened to have in my pocket. When I held it up by my face, all those lasses thought the better of kissing me, I assure you. Will's whistle and their squealing nearly raised the new barn roof off the ridgepole," he said, tossing the riddle to me. I decided that a raising must have been more fun than I'd thought. "Geordie," I asked, lobbing him the riddle with a laugh, "did you ever have another raising to rebuild the barn after part of it burned?" Geordie's face turned sober. "No, times weren't right for a party, and, well, we just fixed it as best we could, made it smaller like it is now." "No mulled cider or apple pie? No husking bee?" I asked. Geordie crowed. "And no red ears or kissing girls." Our laughter threatened to raise the roof yet again, but we abruptly stopped when we heard Dad's voice. "Lars, what are you doing in there? Sounds like a pack of hyenas," he said, coming through the barn door. Some instinct sent me leaping across to stand in front of Geordie. My father frowned and asked, "What's that?" For a second I thought he was asking about Geordie, and I was awash in panic. But his eyes were on the rusty sieve in my hands. "It's a riddle to me, Dad." I said solemnly. What's a riddle to me is what you've been doing out here all this time. You haven't even turned the light on yet. I can't find the switch, I mumbled. It's because there isn't one. You just pull this cord hanging down from the light bulb, here in the middle. The barn was flooded with light. Holding my breath, I looked carefully around. Geordie was nowhere to be seen. Whistling with relief, I walked over and put the riddle back on a large wooden peg jutting from the wall. Figured it must have been hanging there when I dislodged it in the dark. Dad was looking at me kind of funny. Your moods certainly shift gears in a hurry lately, Lars. Mother said you were depressed, and here you are grinning away like a Cheshire cat. He shrugged. Look, I have to run some errands. I want you finished here by the time I get back. Now rake up this old straw and put it in garbage bags to take to the dump. Better toss in that sieve, too. I snatched the riddle off its peg and held it to my chest protectively. Can't I keep it? I guess so. But check with Aunt Cass before you take it in the house. No telling what it's been used for. No telling, I echoed with a grin, as I watched him get in the car with Mom and drive away. After they were out of sight, I picked up the rake and pitched in. Someone cleaning the barn? Didn't seem so boring after all. Quiet, Chapter 5, Bamboozling Aunt Cass. Okay, remember, how did she bamboozle Lars on his first night? Hopefully you answered. She short-sheeted his bed. So, bamboozling Aunt Cass. After I finished in the barn, I picked up the old sieve and headed for the house, ready to pop with excitement about my experience with Geordie. Remember how I boggled at the riderless fence? I punned. That's one riddle solved. Inside, I found Aunt Cass scribbling on a pad of yellow paper, which she quickly turned over when she saw me. I popped the riddle down on the table next to her. Do you like riddles as much as you like puns? I asked. Aunt Cass picked up the sieve, which left a rusty outline on the tablecloth. Instead of chewing me out for making a mess, she only said yes. Aye. But whatever she intended to say was broken off by the sound of a car pulling up. That's the Hargraves' van, she exclaimed, taking my arm and half dragging me out to meet the visitors. My reluctance must have been obvious to Pat Hargraves. After hugging my great aunt, glanced at me and turned red. Hello, Eileen, Aunt Cass said. Sorry to take you away from your Saturday chores. Will, but this is important. She made the introductions, then with a significant look at me, added, Of course George and Pat have already met. Why don't you two youngsters take a walk? We have some business to attend to. Not very enthusiastically, I took off toward the barn. Pat fell into step beside me. Without speaking, we marched past the wagon in the lean-to and stopped by the pond. How about some ducks and drakes? I asked. Her brown eyes opened wide. What? Ducks and drakes. Somebody told me that's what you call skipping rocks around here. She shrugged. As Aunt Cass would say, somebody's been bamboozling you, Lars. Was it Eddie? He loves teasing new kids, probably because he's so out of it himself. Nope, not Eddie, I replied calmly, though inside I felt like shouting in celebration. If Pat Hargraves had never heard of ducks and drakes, she'd probably never met Geordie. Grinning, I picked up a stone and tried to skip it on the water. It skittered about 1 inch and sank. I tried again. This time the rock didn't even skitter, it just sank. Pat squatted down by the edge of the pond, picked up several stones, examined them, and tossed them back down. Finally, finding one that suited her, she turned it over a couple times to fit into her hand properly, then flung it at the pond. Skipped a good 6 or 7 times. Maybe Pat didn't know that skipping rocks was called ducks and drakes, but she was what Geordie would call a dab hand at it. That wasn't too shabby for a girl, I said. Pat tossed her head. It wasn't too shabby. Period. I picked up another rock and, determined not to be outdone by a girl, hurled it with everything I had. Skipped about 10 times. My best throw ever. How about that? I asked proudly. How about what? I wasn't looking for another rock. I was looking for another rock and wasn't watching, she said airily, playing with the ring on her chain.